this event feels timely and relevant given the challenging moment we find ourselves in. But in the midst of all that, I want to express gratitude, for it was in Washington, D.C., a handful of years ago in Georgetown, that I met and befriended someone who has, I would argue, helped transform Letras Latinas in the last 4 years. Tonight's event would not be taking place without his ongoing generosity. And so a shout out to DC resident friend, brother of choice, Jim Wilson. Please join me in expressing our gratitude. As for tonight's poets, each one has long-standing ties to Letras Latinas. Let me highlight some of those connections as a way of introducing them in alphabetical order. Elizabeth Acevedo has actually visited Notre Dame twice. Once, she spent a weekend in South Bend while she was an MFA candidate at the University of Maryland as part of a 4-year initiative that sought to foster and forge community among Latinx MFA candidates in poetry. The cohort Liz formed a part of, for example, included an NYU MFA candidate named Javier Zamora. Liz returned to Notre Dame years later to visit my class, participate in an oral history interview with the PhD student, and give a public reading on campus. But there's more. Liz was also a guest in my spring poetry writing workshop here in Washington, D.C., and she was also part of a 10-poet cohort that took part in the first workshop for the Pintura Palabra initiative across the street at the Smithsonian American Art Museum in February of 2014. Also a participant in that 10-poet cohort involving Latinx poets in 2014 was Juan J. Morales. The Pintura Palabra initiative engaged the traveling exhibit, Our America, the Latino Presence in American Art. Juan also visited Notre Dame a year or so before the pandemic to take part in a community reading in downtown South Bend, in addition to being interviewed for the Letras Latinas Oral History Project, which now numbers more than 70 interviews. And I want to publicly credit Juan as the person who, during a Zoom consultation in 2023, specifically suggested that Letras Latinas celebrate its 20th anniversary with multiple events throughout its milestone year. Although Alexandra Litton Regalado has yet to step on Notre Dame's campus, she is slated to visit in a year and a half as part of a multi-year initiative we're launching in September called Poets and Painters, Writers at the Racklin Murphy Museum of Art. In the meantime, Alex took part in one of our 20th anniversary events last September at the Betsy Hotel in South Florida. She served as one of 2 final judges of the last Andres Montoya Poetry Prize administered by Letras Latinas. And she was a Letras Latinas poet in residence for a week on Capitol Hill several years ago as part of an ancillary program for the Pintura Palabra initiative. Some of the poems she worked on that week found their way into her National Poetry Series winning volume a year or 2 later, selected by Dwayne Reginald Betts. I first met Dan Vera in Kim Roberts' kitchen in the fall of 2007, and we connected instantly. Both he and Kim spearheaded what felt like an informal welcome committee as I began my 13-year stint in the DMV. A few years later, our final judge selected Dan's second book manuscript as the inaugural winner of the Letras Latinas Red Hen Poetry Prize. In the meantime, Letras Latinas is pleased to have had a hand in Red Hen Press informally acquiring Dan's next book. And it goes without saying that Dan was also part of that much alluded to 10-poet cohort at the Smithsonian American Museum in 2014, an ekphrastic workshop designed and delivered by two poets long affiliated with Letras Latinas, former Poet Laureate of Santa Fe, New Mexico, Valerie Martinez, and current Poet Laureate of Wisconsin, Brenda Cardenas. Dan was also my co-presenter a few years ago at the Gelman Library at GW as part of something called A Splendid Wake, a lovely initiative that strives to document and celebrate poetry organizations in the DC region. Dan and I gave a brief account of Letras Latinas in DC. Finally, a word about our moderator this evening. While I have not had the pleasure of as many interactions with Ricardo Ortiz as with our poets, when I survey the field of Latinx letters and think about scholars doing vital work in the field, I think of him. He's had an impact in our field that I think is underappreciated in my view. Among one of his former students, for example, from years ago, is publisher and poet Carmen Jimenez and others. Ricardo was also the person who introduced me to the fine work being done in Georgetown's Lannan Center for Poetics and Social Practice. And a number of years ago, when I was going through a discernment process and I needed a sounding board for some professional matters, Ricardo was kind enough to offer his voice and his astute ear. When I learned that our session tonight required a moderating scholar, it took me about a second to decide that I wanted it to be Ricardo Ortiz. And with that, I'd like to welcome our first poet to the podium, Elizabeth Acevedo.
Good evening. I am so excited to be here with you all. I think that especially those of us who are in DC can sometimes really feel a lot of the energy that's happening in this city. And it feels really special to gather and think about poetry and words and stories and the things we have to say to each other. And really look at each other, not just online and not just doom scrolling, right? And so I'm thankful for this moment and that we could give this moment to poetry. Poets often get like shafted, right? The short end of the stick. And so, how beautiful to be here at MLK with you. I'm going to read a poem that is called La Ciguapa. I'm very interested in mythology and folklore of the Dominican Republic. Unfortunately, I come from a family that is not as interested. And so growing up, I'd be like, Mommy, what are myths? And she's like, girl, the Bible. And so I had to do my own research. And it's funny how our parents all of a sudden have answers if you have the right question. Because when I'd be like, Mommy, have you ever heard of La Ciguapa? She's like, oh, sí, esta tipa de la montaña, right? She gets it then. And so I had to do research and then come back. But this idea of how we engage with mythology in poetry and what doorway we can find in to why we might have made these stories, what they offer us, is something I'm really interested in. La Ciguapa for the Antilles. They say La Ciguapa was born on the peak of El Pico Duarte. Balled up for centuries beneath the rocks, she sprang out red, covered in boils, dried off black, and the first thing she smelled was her burning hair. They say Atabeira carried La Ciguapa while in frog form, held her low in the belly until squatting, she laid her into soft dirt, an egg made of ocean. Millenniums later, La Ciguapa poked through and the blue water burst, grafted onto her skin. They say La Ciguapa pried apart her jaw and spit herself out, soft and malleable, but at the last second, her legs scraped against fangs and inverted her footing. Her backwards facing feet were no mistake, they say. She was never meant to be found, followed, an unseeable creature of crane legs, saltwater crocodile scales, long beak of a parrot no music sings forth from. La Ciguapa, they say, was made on one of those ships, stitched and bewitched from moans and crashing waves. She emerged entirely formed, dark and howling, stepped onto the auction block, but none would buy her. They wouldn't even look her in the eye. They say she came from beneath the Spanish saddle of the first mayor, rubbed together from leather and dark mane, that she was hungry, that she has a hoof between her thighs and loves men the way the mortar loves the pestle. She hums them into the cotton-thick fog of the mountains. They follow her non-word sing-song and try to climb her, tall and dark and rough as sugarcane, and don't know until they're whittled down how they've scraped themselves dead. They say the men were the first to undo her name, thinking that burying it would rot her magic, that long cry they were compelled to answer. They hung all 5-toed dogs. That bit did come from my mother, because they alone knew her scent. They say there was a time her silhouette shadowed the full moon. They say, I'm lying. No one says. Who tells her story anymore? She has no mother, La Ciguapa, and no children, certainly not her people's tongues. We who have forgotten all our sacred monsters. I love this poem by Natalie Diaz because she's the GOAT, right? And so I love every poem by Natalie Diaz. But she does, having grown up in the Mojave tribe in California, in the deserts of California, on a reservation of California, there's an aspect to her work that I just think is often missing when we think about poetry in the landscape of Latinidad, right? Like the American indigenous relationship to land and language. Similarly, this poem is also thinking about mythology and thinking about parables, right? I love me a poem that is thinking about like Eve as a bad bitch. And so this poem does that, but she's always thinking about how do we subvert the received stories of the Bible, the received stories of the people who came here and brought a perspective that was so different than who was already here. And so this is If Eve, Side Stealer, and Mary Busted Chest Ruled the World. What if Eve was an Indian and Adam was never needed from the earth? Eve was earth and ribs were her idea all along. What if Mary was an Indian and when Gabriel visited her wigwam, she was away at a monthly WIC meeting, receiving eggs, boxed cheese, and peanut butter instead of Jesus? What if God was an Indian with turquoise wings and coral breasts who invented a game called White Man Chess, played on silver boards with all white pieces, pawns and kings, and only one side, the white side, and the more they won, the more they were beaten? What if the world was an Indian whose head and back were flat from being strapped to a cradle board as a baby? And when she slept, she had nightmares lit up by yellow-haired men and ship-scraping anchors in her throat. What if she wailed all night while great waves rose up carrying the fleets across her flat back over the edge of the flat world? Thank you.
Hi, how are you? Great to see you. My name is Juan J. Morales. I'm your Western poet for this evening. It's a great pleasure to be here. I want to thank Francisco for all the hard work, David Quick, and all the other beautiful folks at the library here. Beautiful spots. And my beautiful poets that I'm getting to work with, Letras Latinas, and of course our moderator, Ricardo. So thanks for having me. So, I'm gonna make a big mistake and I'm gonna read the poet that has inspired me first because it's a way better poem than mine because he is my goat. So I'll preface it. As an undergrad in one of my first creative writing workshops at Colorado State University Pueblo in Colorado, I found myself filled with excitement, skepticism, doubt, and delight with this new world of poetry. I wrote my share of young writer mistakes and breakthroughs, and on a random day, my mentor, the talented DC poet and translator David Keplinger, gave me poems by Martin Espada. Maybe he sensed my uncertainty or just knew that I needed this. Specifically, he gave me poems from the anthology Poetry Like Bread, Poets of the Political Imagination from Curbstone Press. The book's motto, taken from Roque Dalton, is that poetry, like bread, is for everyone. Poems like Jorge the Church Janitor Finally Quits and Federico's Ghost resonated because finding a Boricua poet gave me a guide to the subversive in the everyday and the playful voice that braids together heartbreak and hilarity all together. In honor of this poetic path to discovery, I've selected to read Martin Espada's poem, The Republic of Poetry, which we need in times like these to buoy us with hope and defiance. Its dedication to Chile is a stern reminder of the past influencing how we face present challenges. The poem's tension comes from strong verbs that elicit the threat of violence, which is ultimately diffused by poetry, being read, printed, and heard. The Republic of Poetry is language, quote, as familiar as conversation and rousing us to, quote, learn and act. The Republic of Poetry by Martin Espada for Chile. In the Republic of Poetry, a train of poets rolls south in the rain as plum trees rock and horses kick in the air, and village bands parade down the aisle with trumpets, with bowler hats, followed by the President of the Republic shaking every hand. In the Republic of Poetry, monks print verses about the night on boxes of monastery chocolate. Kitchens in restaurants use odes for recipes from eel to artichoke, and poets eat for free. In the Republic of Poetry, poets read to the baboons at the zoo, and all the primates, poets and baboons alike, scream for joy. In the Republic of Poetry, poets rent a helicopter to bombard the National Palace with poems on bookmarks, and everyone in the courtyard rushes to grab a poem fluttering from the sky, blinded by weeping. In the Republic of Poetry, the guard at the airport will not allow you to leave the country until you declaim a poem for her, and she says, "Ah, beautiful." Oh, thanks. That's very kind. My next poem is my own poem. It's called Discovering Pain, and I'm very honored that it appears in this beautiful anthology. The poem first appeared in my second collection, The Siren World, which focused on the mountain, parentheses, my Ecuadorian mother, and the island, my Puerto Rican father. I grew up in a Spanish-speaking household in Colorado Springs, and I did not speak Spanish. It was always a point of tension and insecurity as I continued to learn my parents' tongue as an adult. Hashtag Duolingo. Specific to this poem, it connects to core memories shaped into a prose poem with a dash of In the Waiting Room by Elizabeth Bishop, associated flashes of historical pain, and a small homage to Robert Hayden's Those Winter Sundays, ending the poem with a question. Discovering Pain. I was 16 and skateboarding on a failed double kickflip, ankles loud pop. I went on with my day in the swell of pain, small ankle bone floating with snapped cartilage, one of those first moments of learning my fragility. I used to always sacrifice body and told myself, it'll heal, no worries. Now, I sometimes bang a finger or suffer a magnificent garden scratch and claim them for the attention. But in instances with more at stake, moments of failing family or mourning love's purest hurt, I am paralyzed to speak. Perhaps this paradox, hiding in the open, helps me study my obsessions, like conquest centuries earlier, the ink and rain coming undone as an ache I did not witness but read in the Andes and in pages. I am guided toward historical pain, a shrine built on the journey to museums, the pondering of a PBS documentary on a Friday night, a National Geographic, in a waiting room eerily similar to Bishop's childhood memory. The untouched structures still buried around Machu Picchu. But what happens when the hurt I reference involves a skateboard, an ankle, or a childhood bloodied kneecap, minor images hundreds of years later, and still a continent removed, coming too late, coming too late. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here and to form a part of this anthology. My name's Alexandra Litton Regalado, and I'm coming to you from El Salvador, which is the country where now they threaten you to be sent to if you si te portas mal. So I'm going to be reading 2 poems tonight. My first poem, La Mesa, is a response to El Salvador's political situation in the early 2010s. And it's in conversation with Carolyn Forché's 1981 poem, The Colonel. And though these poems are about 30 years apart, you'll find that similar themes emerge, as if a glitch in time illuminates how corruption is deeply rooted and continues to flourish in El Salvador. The Civil War's past parallels the present, as similar atrocities are committed in a perpetual cycle of poverty, hyper-surveillance, and violence. This poem is part of my first book, which is entitled Matria. And the second poem, which I will be reading tonight, is by Claribel Alegría, who is actually the person who inspired me to title my book Matria, because she's both Nicaraguan and Salvadoran, and she said, "Tengo matria y tengo patria." So we'll hear a poem by Claribel Alegría afterwards. La Mesa. Yes, what you've written is true. A Salvadoran colonel might have collected a sack full of human ears in the late 70s. I know a retired colonel, and I've heard his talk to consider it possible. The death squads of the 80s, certainly not a subject for dinner conversation, which, according to my grandmother, should glide over pleasant topics and promote easy digestion. I've sat with threaded lips listening to stories of the ex-guerrilla leader, now our current president, of the former president's shopping binges and a totaled Ferrari, a winning mayor's campaign, go-go dancers grinding on a table in their political party-colored thongs, of gang leaders watching their flat screens alongside lovers in their hotel prisons, of 6 p.m. city buses overturned and lit on fire. The men pound their hands on the polished wood and the wine goblets jump. The red liquid sloshes in the crystal wells. I've watched the waiters dressed in white tuxedo jackets, the black moth of death clinging to their throats as they listen, offering a second helping of roast lamb. We've left behind the sandbag street corners, and now it's only the bodyguards driving us around in bulletproof SUVs that keep us from the gun-toting assailant at the stoplight. the thick glass that separates us from the children begging at their mother's side, and my own child asking, "What does she want, Mom? Where's her car? Where's her house?" And the driver staring ahead at the road through the tinted glass, his ears listening and listening for my reply. What to answer? This is something for my poetry, no? Would my hand move toward the knife as those on the left and right argue for their peace, the country carved up like a pie? In the morning, I'll hold my grandmother's porcelain cup and pour sugar into the bitter black while I read the newspaper, guaranteed a ladle of casualties, dead bodies splayed across page 2. All this news sounding like the maid saying, "A dish broke." The action disembodied of any blame or fault, an object finished or disappeared of its own volition. My husband across the table says with his eyes, "Say nothing." And I think of this life, of pears stewed in wine, the instant gratification of artichoke hearts, the chalice always refilled, music in stereo, and the velvet wind through the pines, a pair of loyal dogs sleeping at our feet. The moon shines its white beam across the lawn's smooth plain. The next poem, Letter to an Exile, can easily be read in parallel to the story of all immigrants, the act of weaving and unweaving an interminable cloth, as this poem addresses Odysseus and Penelope's story in the Odyssey. During this long wait, it feels particularly resonant here because illustrating the sense that in telling a story, our memory of the events it describes can often shift. I feel comfortable reading this only in English, although the poem does appear in Spanish because it was translated by Claribel's husband. Letter to an Exile. My dear Odysseus, it is no longer possible, my husband, that time goes flying by without my telling you of my life in Ithaca. Many years have gone by since you left. Your absence weighs on your son and me. My suitors began to fence me in. They were so many and so tenacious in their flattery that a god, taking pity on my anguish, advised me to weave a subtle, interminable cloth that would serve as your shroud. If I finished it, I would have to choose a husband without delay. The idea captivated me. At sunrise, I set about weaving, and I unwove during the night. That went on for 3 years, but now, Odysseus, my heart yearns for a youth as handsome as you when young, as expert with bow and lance. Our house is in ruins, and I need a man who knows how to rule it. Telemachus is but a babe, and your father decrepit. It is preferable, Odysseus, that you don't return. Men are weaker. They can't tolerate affronts. Of my love for you, not even embers remain. Telemachus is well, never asks for his father. It would be better if we gave you up for dead. I know from strangers about Calypso and Circe. Seize your chance, Odysseus. If you choose Calypso, you'll regain lost youth. If Circe is the chosen one, among her swine, you'll reign supreme. I hope this letter does not offend you. Don't invoke the gods. It will be in vain. Remember Menelaus and his Helen. For that mad war, our best men have lost their lives, and you are where you are. Don't return, Odysseus. I beg you, your discreet Penelope. Great. I just love her attitude in that poem, right? Like how she's just like, don't return, men are weaker. And, you know, she closes by basically saying her love has gone to ash. And she brings up his affairs. But really, I mean, aside from that very strong feminine stance, which I very much respond to, I'm also very much drawn to her reference about the war, right? She says that mad war where our best men have lost their lives. And indeed, Alegria's poetry is often intertextual and grounded in history. When she accepted the Queen Sofia Prize for Ibero-American Poetry in 2017, she explained, "My poetry then was lyrical. It never occurred to me at that time to write poems that reflected the misery of my two homelands. I thought Central American dictators were inevitable, so beyond remedy, like the earthquakes and storms that battered my region. But I changed over time and began to write poems that reflect the suffering, the injustices, and the cruelties. More than political poems, I call them love poems." And so I think that as I was speaking to Ricardo earlier, I do see La Mesa as a love poem for my country. And I do believe that it's a poem that could be rewritten every decade, and it would reflect a strikingly constant condition against the backdrop of a new period. So maybe the tables would change and the characters around that table would change. But that imposed or voluntary silence of the speaker and of those sitting at the present and future dinner tables hisses like a loop, and it's the same tapestry that's weaving and unweaving itself. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Dan Vera, and it's a real delight to be here, to be part of this anthology, to be here reading with poets. Three poets that I know and love and have not seen in a long time in many cases, but I'm so thankful to all the organizers, Francisco and David with the DC Library. The two poems, I'm going to start with a poem of mine that's in the anthology. It appears in my second book. When I found out that this was the poem that had been selected, you never know exactly which poem is going to appear. And I was not surprised exactly, but I was sort of delighted that in the poem, my father, who passed away in 2014, he's in the poem because it's about him. But also my husband, Pete, is in the poem too. And so it was just to have those two, the memory of those two appearing in the poem. So I don't know what else to say. The poem kind of speaks for itself. Small Shame Blues. I live with the small shame of not knowing the multiple names for blue, to describe the night sky over New Mexico, to describe the light in my lover's eyes. It is a small shame that grows. I live with the small shame which resides in the absences of my speech as I pause to search for the word in Spanish to translate a poem to my father, who sits there waiting, who scans my eyes to see what I cannot fully describe, who waits for the word from me, the word that escapes me in the moment, the word I fear has never resided within me. It is a small shame that grows when indigo and cerulean are merely azul and not añil and ceruleo. When I was tasked to sort of find another poem in this anthology, this anthology is kind of a miracle in so many ways. There are poems in this anthology that I'd heard about. You know, I grew up, both my parents, recited poetry, knew poetry, would recite Jose Marti because they were Cubans, and a couple of other poets. And there are poets that are in this anthology that are now together and translated, which is a major thing. And so, and then there are poems by poets who I'd heard of and never read anything of. And this poem, which I believe has only been anthologized one other time, is an example of that. The poem I'm reading is by Jose Davila Semprit, the Puerto Rican poet. And this poem is about almost 100 years old. It's 1933. And as I read it, I know you'll be struck in the same way I was that this poem could easily be written today with some changes in events. I'm getting my statement in first because I think once I read the poem, I'm not going to be able to say anything else. But the poem really made me think about Galway Kinnell writing that poetry was really standing up and saying with as little concealment as possible what it is for him or her to be alive on earth at this moment. And Semprit's poem in 1933, like so many of the poems in this anthology, are really testaments to their time, and they're also echoes of our own time. The United States. A sublime document that proclaims the rights of man, a star-spangled banner, history that begins with a roaring rebelliousness and ends up smelling of imperialism. A heterogeneous people, the remains of our old Europe turned into a republic, an alloy of passions, prejudices, and entrenched arrogance. Deceit has become a god in America, the belly laugh of the century, the sarcasm of this era, the United States. In its port, there is a statue lying about liberty, insulting the cosmos. Within, there is injustice. Sacco, Vanzetti, Mooney, the Blacks of Scottsboro, the cry of the mothers whose sons have died in imperialist campaigns, the cry of the sons whose mothers strayed into vice, the Ku Klux Klan growling fanaticism, the persecuted Indian in the mountains, the black man passed over and persecuted, the Bible feeding ignorance, mitigated pain with the Puritan prayer of the dead, the United States. Sorrow, grief that chauvinism quells, hatred, resentment fired by religion, endless smell of blood in the atmosphere, mediocrity in a tunic made flesh, new life in the temple of the god Janus, Minerva's altar in ruins, a desire for power within each soul, the word of God out on each lip, the United States. Reigning in Detroit, Chicago, New York, huge smoke-belching beasts eating human flesh, baring their fangs and pretending to rend the sky. Detroit aspires to pollute the heavens with the spit of its factories. Chicago has a place in the history of crime, perpetuating itself with the shooting and abuses of its gunmen. New York is unique and supreme with its Tammany Hall, elegant refuge of very 20th century robbers, and with its Wall Street tentacles, the narrow and foul-smelling hideout of gin art. Continuous movement, huge factories that suck up the blood of the worker, politicians, bankers, and bandits. 3 different people and one true swindler, the United States.
Okay, we have 25 minutes, says our our dear leader. Thank you. So thank you to everyone for being here, and I just want to thank Francisco for the honor of this invitation to be part of this remarkable event. And I think just to start, could we have a round of applause again for this remarkable group of artists, writers, thinkers, and perhaps also for Rigoberto Gonzalez, without whom there wouldn't be this collection. So my job is easy because I will succeed if I say as little as possible and just give the floor to the people before us to converse among themselves and to lead us in whatever exchange we can have. And then there might be a tiny bit of time for a Q&A at the end. Okay, so you'll have your say as well. But look, this was a remarkable opportunity, right, to see, you know, it's there in the book, but I think the living example that you all just performed for us of the remarkable power and openness and committedness of poetry across your work, but also the work by the other poets that you chose to read for us. I love the historical reach from Davila Semprit to the present, to, let's say, your work, but also to somebody like Natalie Diaz's work, who's so open and so present in the moment. I'm reminded, I promise I'll stop speaking in a moment. So last week I was at Ada Limon's closing lecture of her National Poet Laureateship. And her address was, it's available on YouTube, by the way, is called Against Breaking, and the subtitle is the private and public power of poetry. And I just saw that in the work that you all presented tonight. And I guess I just would want to open it up to see who among you would want to talk about this, but we're in this moment, we're in this present moment that we can approach from all of these different angles and through all of these different sort of kind of methods that we have in the kind of work that you're all doing as poets. But can I ask just if you would want to sort of begin by reflecting on what you think poetry should be doing in this moment? What can it do in this moment? What must it do in this moment? Let's just start with that. Or
Bueno, all right. I have something to say. I feel like, especially coming from where I'm coming from, right now, in this moment of hyper-vigilant anxiety and fear that is very true, I feel like our greatest tool is metaphor. Because when reality is impossible to be talked about directly, we have to go through its slant, you know, as Emily Dickinson said, right? Tell its slant. So we're still able to talk about the things that are on our minds and that calling for change, but perhaps through symbol and myth and folklore and other kind of ways.
I don't know if my mic is on. I gotta turn it on. Where's mine? Oh, okay. I'm thinking a lot about the early days of the pandemic and how all of a sudden people who had never shown any interest in poetry were sharing poems and posting poems and using poems as a way to try to make sense of feelings they couldn't language, right? And I think that we are in a moment that is very similar in that there's a lot of confusion and an onslaught of language being thrown at us that you have to sift through. And the clarity of the poet's ability to, I mean, I love that Galway Canal, right? Like this, in this moment, it's just a lack of concealment. And we're dealing with a lot of concealment, right? Like there's always the language and then the thing behind it that's really happening. And so poetry trying to provide clarity, I think there's something really powerful there for the everyday person that we think that it's how do we return to it not just being poets reading poetry, right? Like we all know each other, but like this offering of language where we might not have language for certain moments feels really important. And also that I think this moment is about language entirely. Like there is a story being told about who we are as a country that people are that people began to believe when folks weren't paying attention to the stories we were telling. This is entirely about language and the way that we are influenced, right? And all the different vehicles of influence. And so I think that I wish there was a way that we could just like drop poems everywhere or like just like, that sounds really violent. Let's not do that. But you know what I'm saying? But this like very aggressive way of saying the people have been doing the work for centuries, for a long time of offering clarity, like how do we distribute it so that we can counter the stories being told with a different kind of truth or the truth.
We're going down the line, so that gave me some. Thank you both for that, and for that great question. I think to kind of riff with this great question and wisdom is, on a personal note, I came to poetry because it was the right vessel to tell stories, and it came from family, heritage, and place. Because a lot of times I cite my parents as like a primary influence of my poetry because they were just daily storytellers, and it kind of reminds me of this current state of time where there's this issue of visibility and invisibility. And I think there's a lot of fear and urgency with the idea of, well, being disappeared and our stories disappearing and our communities being erased or eroded. So poetry seems to be like a nice, concise vessel, a nice snapshot of a moment, a nice snapshot of emotion, or a great song like that you just heard. And I think those snapshots of the way that you all are articulating so beautifully is just a great way to kind of share it and pass it forward, like eye contact or just like a nice conversation that we took for granted before the pandemic and that we're grateful to have now. And I think poetry is going to continue to help with that conversation.
No comment. No, okay. I
only have this one question.
Yeah, that's. Oh, okay. Cool. I'm done. I guess the first thought that leapt into my mind is, one of the things that we're called to do is, or one of the things that we're called to do is to bear witness. And so, I think there's great evidence in this anthology of people who bore witness to the time in which they were living in. And I think that's sort of to bear witness is also kind of talismanic. It's basically holding up a talisman against erasure, against somehow feeling, it's one of the things that, we struggle to basically believe that our lives are worth something, that our lived experience is worth something, that it's worthy of being recorded, that we are worthy of building community and honoring our community and safeguarding our community, all those things. And we're living in a very vile and violent time in which people are trying to subsume us in this erasure, this mass delusional erasure of history and community, to somehow digitally removing names and words and somehow saying that these histories don't exist. And I think that's where our ability to sort of kind of tell our stories and to lift up other people's stories is really important. I think bearing witness is really kind of what we're called to do in many ways.
And again, as always, just feel free to talk amongst yourselves. So it's not an interrogation and it's not an interview, right? We can make this into a conversation. But a writer that I've been thinking about a lot recently is Reinaldo Arenas, because there are just these moments in Before Night Falls, right? Like that book is a narrative of just watching his country turn into what it turned into, right? And there are a lot of different sort of political interpretations of that, but in the way that he experienced it and the oppression that he experienced there, et cetera, right? And that memoir is such a cry against autocracy and that kind of political sort of domination, right, and oppression. He says there's one point where he says all dictatorships hate beauty and freedom. I'm murdering the line, but it's something along those lines. And I think that this is the moment that we're in. Look, so this is the moment that we're in, and you just gave us this wonderful sort of demonstration of all the sort of the variety of ways that poetry can happen, the way it can work. And I heard across the collection this moment tonight dimensions of the work that were mythological, but also rewriting mythology and taking some of the authority and the power of mythology to do something different with it and something new. I also heard a strain of called the historical, but I really mean also the political, that was running through a lot of the pieces, maybe not consistently through all of them. And of course, ultimately the personal. And I could give examples of these, but I think maybe if you all have these in mind, obviously we can start with Elizabeth and the sort of rewriting of the legend of La Sihuapa that you gave us in conversation with Diaz's rewriting of the sort of mythic embodiment of Eve and Mary and the sort of the mythology of Christianity through, for example, Claribel Alegria's rewriting of the remarkable rewriting of the Odyssey and of Penelope's relationship to Odysseus in the context of exile, in the context of war, right? I'll start there, but just, myth, history, the personal.
No, I know it was put on me. I'm just like, all right, okay. I think that the way in for me is this idea. The story we would want to believe is that I sat at my abuela's knee and she told me all this folklore, and then I received it and was able to feel empowered about the stories we told, right? And yet I know very few Dominicans that had that kind of experience with myth, right? But growing up, I absolutely loved Xena Warrior Princess and was obsessed with Greek mythology, right? And knew all of the Grecian Isles, but couldn't tell you a single figure from the Dominican Republic. And it was this moment, I think, of that these figures had long been erased, right? That it's not a now thing, right? That they had been supplanted from my mother's memory and her mother's memory and her mother's memory. And my dad, when I was telling him I'm looking at folklore, I'm thinking about folklore, I want to see what poetry has already been here that I can look to. And he's like, oh, eso de campesino, right? As a city kid, he's like, that's something else. That belongs to the people who would believe in those things because they're not civilized enough, right? It's pagan, right? And so there's just so much fodder there, right? We have forsaken our sacred monsters, that there is a moment to be monstrous. And I think for those of us who have been denied the ability to be monstrous when you arrive and we have our claws and our teeth and we're ready, and instead we're told be good and be docile, what is happening with why we removed that from our ability to turn to, that we come from beings that, will lead you into the mountains, and they're gonna get you lost, and you're not gonna be seen again. right? And so I think in the retellings, I'm curious about what is offered, but also the removal, and whose project was that, and how long has it been around? And I think you know, Natalie Diaz is approaching it in a particular way of, and she does this all the time, right? Where she's confronting a very common story, and she provides indigeneity as a way in that just radicalizes the idea of what you thought you knew. Like, you thought you knew Mary, but she's getting government cheese and like kicking it like with the homie. She don't want to talk to Gabriel. Like, Gabriel, don't come here with that story. I'm cool, right? Like, and so I love the modernization of some of these pieces that we think we receive as a kind of truth, or a kind of whatever, mythology, a parable we must hold, and finding different ways around it. I think it offers so much richness to how we can move through the world. And going to your first question, especially in moments where we might be required to kind of pull up a little bit more thorough than maybe we have been, because we've been told, like, just be passive.
I think there's a really curious thing about Claribel having chosen to retell, because I don't really think that it's a reinterpretation. It pretty much sticks to the story. It's more the fact that it's an epistolary model and that her voice is a little more edgier than maybe. But I think this also leads me to think about translation, right? Because if this myth first was in, you know, one of the classic languages, which I don't know which one it was originally written in, or oral, you know, orally passed along, and that she then wrote it in Spanish and it was translated through with her husband, I think that particularly the work of Claribel Alegría is very important, because not only was she a writer, but she was an editor, and she was an active translator along with her husband. And right now, in these moments where it's difficult to access those narratives that possibly in many of the home countries are not allowed to circulate freely, that is when our job as writers, as translators, as editors really becomes the work of activism, by translating it to another language and circulating it in other countries, so that more people are aware of other narratives that are not state-sponsored.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on that, and that the poem I read, the Simprit poem, I think, as I said, I really wasn't familiar with him, and there's not a lot of biographical material about him. And I was really struck. He published 2 books of poetry in his lifetime, and before he died, he was working. He was living in Puerto Rico, but he was working on an anthology of Latin American poets in America, in the United States, and of course never lived to sort of see that completed. But of his poems, he published a number of poems in Spanish that were never translated. And I'm struck, one poet who was like really pivotal to me starting off was Pablo Neruda, and loved Neruda, and I just couldn't get enough of Neruda. And there was a moment when I realized that the reason I was reading, I would try to get the bilingual edition so I could check the translation, but also, I was really struck when I discovered that the reason Neruda was in my hands in the United States was because it was a 30-year project of people translating his work, and in a way that frankly has not happened to most Latin American. There are other Nerudas out there. Those are not to take anything away from Neruda, but there were people who were enamored with his work enough to actually sort of put in the time to translate it and publish it. And I just wanted to give another. I heard Alex Reed give a presentation at a conference a couple of weeks ago, and she talked about sort of the importance of translation, and that's incredibly important. We had a poet from Uruguay here in DC a couple of months back, Miguel Avero, and he, gay Uruguayan poet, amazing work. And the only reason I'm familiar with it is somebody actually took the time to actually translate that work, find a publisher, and sort of we need to sort of like not only lift up the voices, here in the United States, but also kind of make those connections with writers and writing and communities. Many communities that we're connected to maybe familiarly, but communities that have experienced what we're experiencing now in this country. Those are histories and poems that are like the guidebook to how to deal with sort of repressive regimes. And those are kind of voices that are important to lift up as well.
I appreciate you talking about translation, because when I started studying poetry in grad school and undergrad, leaping poetry and translation, those things definitely helped my voice come to fruition, because I think a lot of times as writers and readers, we're always struck by those moments where we discover I didn't know we could do that moments when we read. And so a lot of writers have countlessly helped me with that journey. And circling back to the poet I selected for tonight, Martín Espada, I mentioned in my reference, there's a poem called Federico's Ghost. And basically it's a ghost story. It's a ghost story about a migrant worker that dies, and he just the ghost spends the whole time giving the crop dusting plane the middle finger. And I was just like, wow. So we can have ghosts, we can flip people off, and things like that. And to kind of connect to Ricardo's original question about myth and legend and things like that, on a personal note, I've always been driven to horror movies, ghost stories, and things like that. My Ecuadorian mother and I would always bond with Night Court, Golden Girls, and horror movies. So, in no particular order, because there's that kind of aspect of it. So, kind of taking the and I can't believe I'm going to do this, but I'm going to lean into the pop cultural aspects of things. Max Brooks, the author of World War Z, in an interview paraphrased that we write about zombies, we write about horror, because we don't want to have a serious dialogue about pandemics and things like that. And here we are. So authors like that, horror stories, ghost stories like that, kind of helped me kind of discover that can be the mythology. The pop culture that we write about today can be part of that mythology and legend. So yeah, I'll stop there.
I told you my job would be easy. So we can actually open it up to a Q&A. So if anyone in the audience has a question. Okay. Borrow my mic.
Thank you, Francisco. Excited to be here, along with my writing community, Tintas. I have a hot take. We tend to think of the published word as the final version of a work or a poem, but as writers, our writing evolves with us, including previously published work. This is for everyone on the panel. Do you want to share about a poem that's already been published, but has been evolving with you over time, or maybe more recently, you're looking at it with fresh eyes or in a new context? Thank you.
I'll go first. It's kind of easy in my case because the poem I read today was, my father was a Methodist minister, very conservative. I'm gay, of course. I've been out most of my life, but struggling with my identity and the cosmological framework of imagining a world in which I could exist and have a good life and meet someone and love someone. All those things were wrapped up in a very conservative, upbringing. And so my relationship with my father was very tumultuous. And so there's that experience of sort of most of the poems about him, and I've written about him before, are humorous because he was a very funny guy. But there's something about sort of writing something about someone when they're alive and then having the experience of reading them and putting them out in the world once they're gone, and understanding that that work is the representation of that person, and so yeah, the relationship sort of changes over time. It's a fascinating. It's something I did not think about when I wrote the poem, and yet at the same time, I'm still having this dialogue with him, even all these years after having written. So I think those things change, especially because I tend to write about people and experiences. And the only other thing I'd say is, poems, I write about a lot of historical and political, and those things have certainly shifted, certainly in the last couple of years. So, I think you're right. I mean, those things are malleable and change, and a reader's response to them radically change all the time. So I think it is this kind of fluid quicksilver, even though it's on the page. So.
Thanks for the great question. My new book is all. My father passed away 6 years ago. Scary Boricua, 30 plus years in the U.S. military, things like that. And I was having a conversation with a dear friend today, and we were talking about this question of like how do you remember things? In the context of this book and my father, there was this question of like how do you remember the things he said, and so vividly and things like that. So. There's like this constant when we were talking about it, we were talking about how like whenever my family starts to talk about my dad, we put on the dad voice, and things like that. So there's there's like that channeling of that person and that memory. And when I was writing the poems, like when he was alive, I wrote a lot of them while he was alive, but then. When he passed, there was a shift with how I was perceiving them, and it kind of gave me a reminder of what I always nag my students about. There's intention when you write something, you just feel compelled to write it, and then you release it into the world, and then hopefully the people that in your writing group or elsewhere receive or listen to the work, and then they point out the beautiful things you've done. And I'll be honest with you, it's like 70% of the time they're like, you meant to do that? And I say, yes, absolutely, absolutely, yes. And so I think I think that's the other beautiful thing about is when you free the intention of the poem into the world, it allows you to rediscover it along with your community.
I'll take it in a different direction. I think what Dan was saying really hit home, but I'm also at the level of the performer. When you've lived with a poem for a long time, there's a way that you begin to respond to it differently, right? La Ciguapa was written almost a decade ago, right? Like all my poems, I don't have a collection. I may never have a collection at this point because I sit on it and I'm too. That's a different story. That wasn't the question. And so what I'm thinking about here is that our ear grows with us, right? And it's looking for a different music than what we may have had when we first wrote that. And so I'll get on a stage and there's a rhythm that I'm finding or I'm in, but then I'm like, oh, I don't need that word. So I'm editing as I'm working because the Elizabeth who would write this poem now wasn't the one who published that poem. And I'm okay with that. Maybe because the first workshop I had was within hip hop. And so it's like, yeah, you meet the moment, you change, you remix, you freestyle sometimes if you got to find your way back in. And so there's an aliveness to the work that I'm okay with it having, that it's not like it's printed and now this is perfect. Even at the level of the novels that I've written, when I go to record the audiobook, that's really my last draft, right? Because my ear does something that I need to hear it. And so I think there's something to be said about the published poem, but also the breath we give it and how when we grow and we change, it's okay. There's some audiences where I'm like, it's gonna feel different. I need to do something else here. And it's my poem, so I can do that. And if you don't like it, buy the book and read it your way.
I guess just real quickly, Going back to Juan, and we talked quickly at AWP, the Dead Fathers Club. The last book that my second book, I wrote it kind of all in the rush during the pandemic, and I wrote probably all the poems in about 3 months. And it was very different publishing experience from my first book that kind of rattled around the shore for many years before it got picked up. But this book got picked up right away. And so when I got notice of that, I kind of was shocked because the poems that you write in a moment where life and death is so in your face, and after, I had lost so many people in my family, I kind of realized that maybe if I had had more time to sit with those poems, I might not have said everything with such honesty. But then I kind of felt like I had to be satisfied that those poems were sent out into the world and that they were going to exist as a kind of time capsule. And that it was then going to be my job to continue write new poems that were kind of like in that same vein of like rewriting, redoing that shroud, that tapestry. We do and undo constantly. Yeah.
Can I just add, because you invoked Martin Espada. It reminds me of like one of his famous quotes, which was, "If you ever want to hide any writing from your family, put it in your book."
Yeah, that's true.
I don't know if that's true or not, but
Do we have time for one more question? One more question?
Hi, thank you so much for this event and being here. So while you guys were up, you both presented your own poems and poems in the anthology that are either decades old or centuries old. And in the time that we're in right now, I kind of just want to ask how you confront the possibility that your own work and kind of the themes that exist in your own work might come under fire or possibly be centered in time, and kind of how that might influence your writing in this period of time.
I don't think I can think about that. I mean, I really, it's a great question, but I just, and it's certainly, it's something I've thought about, but, this, I mean, what we're living in the middle of now is sort of a revved up thing that's existed at least the last, 10, 20 years. Arizona was doing book bans. When was that? 12, 15 years ago? Now it's gone nationwide. And so, we're certainly kind of in a, but, it's, part of it's just you kind of have to write what's before you, and what gets anthologized. I don't know about that.
So I've been banned, right? So this idea of censorship is something I'm constantly confronting, and I'm banned for like my most innocent book, which I'm like, I don't get it. Okay, but I think often that I am not nearly as brave as like Toni Morrison and Alice Walker and Lucille Clifton and like the folks who I look at and I'm like, they were writing that when, and they just said it straight up to who, and like. And they got published how, right? And so when I think of the things that I'm writing, and there are moments where I'm like, oh, is this gonna be the thing? Is this the subject? The first thing is that like I said, the book I thought would be the least offensive, the fact that that's the one, it shows me I can't anticipate what it is that is going to get pulled, right? Because that I'm so outside of the project that is taking place. And it is so purposeful and it's so intentionally evil that I just can't even see the direction that it's going in. But it's also like I can only be as brave as I can possibly be in the steps that I'm following of these writers who were writing under circumstances that I think were incredibly difficult, to say the truth, and they still did it. And so that is what I challenge myself with when I sit down, that I edit myself enough, right? Like I'm telling myself in my own head enough that I'm not good enough and I'm not this and no one's gonna wanna read this. I don't need to then also add on to that and the book banners are cut, right? Like it would just be too many audiences I'm trying to appease, and that's not the point. I hope not to be liked by everyone, right? Like what kind of book is. And so that it is intentionally for and to particular folks. And that is going to make some people angry, and that's okay. Or that's what I try to tell myself.
Totally. I think about what Dan said and how nobody reads poetry, but then also think about how crazy it is, no? Just to think, that words can be considered so catalytic and transformative that they would actually be banned. And so for me, that's just like, all right.
I think, yeah. Sorry to cut off the applause. That's good applause. I guess what I would say is I'm gonna use a sports ball metaphor because I play soccer and I'm a short dude, and oftentimes on the field I'm how do I say this? I'm not expected to be competitive, and I think that's the same thing that happens with literature is it's underappreciated and underestimated, even though my dear friends up here gave you ample examples of how powerful it can be, and the fact that we're in this beautiful public space demonstrates that as well. So let it be underestimated, but also know, similar to like the fight for reproductive rights across these states, we are resourceful. And we are here for each other, and I think those kinds of mindsets will help. And I think in those there are definitely those scary moments where that I would echo, like you want to censor yourself, or like maybe I'm scared to post that thing on social media. But I think we look for those braver moments, even if it's a smaller private moment that's just helping your neighbor or someone close by.
I just wanted to add that, one of the things that makes this evening possible, and evenings like this and events like this possible around the country, was a sizable grant that the Library of America was able to get from the National Institutes of Humanities, and that's funding that is just in the middle of being completely slashed and eviscerated. That's happening in real time. There's a writer here who just came from like a, huge meeting of all these kind of organizations that are trying to figure out what to do with their funding, and not lay off all their staff. Those are all, the creative arts. It's not as if the creative arts have been massively supported in this country anyway, compared to other, industrialized countries. But, what little was there is in the middle of, that has been a long-term project. And so those fights are, we're in the middle of it and we're in the thick of it. And that resourcefulness that we're going to have to figure out how to be resourceful. And I was so glad that you mentioned, Morrison and Walker and those earlier, it's good to sort of tell those stories and know that history, because those are examples of communities that had no funding, that had to find ways to actually make art and support each other while they were making art, and support the communities that are going to be, continue to create art. That's kind of the vital. I don't want to say it's a vital project, but it's that's the country we're living in right now, and that's kind of the reality. We have to sort of write to and organize to as well.
Books are for sale. Thank you. Yes, I think we're good. Thank you all again. This is really remarkable, and thank you all for being here. And we can move to the the book signing.